when you're in school for doing this kind of psyops work, most people wash out. And most people wash out, like, not because they can't do enough push-ups or whatever it is, but most people wash out because you kind of have to be a sociopath to be able to do this work, right? You have to be able to essentially lie and deceive people in ways that are, far beyond, the little kind of white lies that, all of us engage in.
I am subject to media manipulation campaigns all the time. Not because I'm someone special, but because I live in the same media environment that you do, and therefore you are also probably subject to these same manipulation techniques. That's what advertising is. It's what political campaigning is, and it's certainly what a lot of social media is. But there's now a new class of technologies that goes a step further and moves from just predicting what kinds of videos you will find funny or persuasive or just rage-baiting enough to share, into predicting directly the brain state that will result if you are shown a particular video or text or image. This technology has been around for a long time. It relies on fMRI scanning, which is a pretty standard technique. But in the last month, there has been a big improvement in our ability to predict what exactly the brain will do when shown a given image. This doesn't mean that we're at the mind-reading stage of technology yet. This machine still requires your active participation, and it's very obvious when it's happening. You get put in a big machine to make the predictions anywhere half decent. But the fact there is this tendency towards systems that are more and more capable of predicting you, of controlling you, and of manipulating you without you even realizing it is, of course, deeply concerning. And it's a power that certainly shouldn't be in the hands of the people it's currently in, and ideally shouldn't really be in the hands of anyone at all. So where did this all come from? You probably have heard of the program MK Ultra. It was a secret program run by the CIA to test the limits of human manipulation. But there is so much more to the story of how we ended up in our manipulative media environment. Sycophantic chatbots, psyops, blatant media lies, disinformation campaigns, deepfakes, conspiracy theories that take people to the edge of madness, conspiracy theories that turn out to be true, the practice of flooding the zone with shit, as Trump Lieutenant Steve Bannon once put it. We are in a deep crisis when it comes to ascertaining what it is that is true and what it is that is false. That's why we have to do our own research. So who do you talk to when your thoughts are spiraling like these are? Trevor Paglen. Trevor Paglen is one of the most important artists in the world right now, but also one of the most generative thinkers on the questions of media manipulation, the history of those technologies. And he's also a really lovely guy who is definitely not psyoping anyone. And one of the few people in the world who will indulge my long-standing and extremely embarrassing interest in UFOs. This is one of those conversations that goes all over the map, from our conversations with Alfred McCoy about the history of the Cold War subterfuge, right through to Quinn Slobodian and Ben Tarnoff's theories about where the Elon Musk empire might be heading next, particularly Cyborg Musk. Hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Trevor Paglen, welcome to your own research.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here today with you.
We spoke about 3 years ago, and we spoke about your work documenting CIA black sites. We spoke about aliens, UFOs, the UFO phenomena. But one thing we didn't speak about, and one thing I didn't ask you because it would be insane, more insane than UFOs, more insane than networks of black sites, is whether or not you think a substantial portion of global power is wielded by elite billionaire pedophiles with plausible connections to Israeli intelligence. I didn't ask you that because it's obviously insane. It is now 2026, right? It is not 2023 anymore, those wonderful halcyon days when everything was clear, when everyone understood everything that was going on, right? We are now through the looking glass. Do you think, to some extent, that conspiracy theory has been validated as a methodology for understanding the world?
That's a really good question. To a certain extent, yes. And what I used to live down the street from a guy who was a very famous CIA officer, the guy who the movie Syriana was based on. And I was in graduate school at the time, and we would have lunch from time to time. We were friends. And it was just really interesting to talk to him because, he would look at like the work I was doing, in social science and say like, you're analyzing this and your theories of value and, structural forms of power. And he's like, that's all there. But there is something to be said for knowing that the nephew of this Saudi prince who's the head of this part of the Defense Department is gay. And nobody knows it. And he's like, that has enormous geopolitical consequences that you cannot understand through a kind of structural lens. So that's a long way of saying, yes, there is something to that in the sense that there are actors and those actors have idiosyncrasies. And those idiosyncrasies can have huge, snowball effects.
I feel like we're in a kind of an epistemic crisis in a way. And what I mean by that, after the kind of the Epstein revelations, because it seems like things that were supposed to be fully discredited have been, to some extent proven to be accurate. Although, of course, it's very possible to say that the hit rate of conspiracy theories not very high, right? Like, there are loads of conspiracy theories. Only a handful of them have been proven to be correct. But I do feel like we are almost in a kind of what you might think of thinking about the history of science, almost like a post-paradigmatic stage in the history of sociology, where structural accounts in a very sophisticated Marxian kind of language or the kind of general apparatus of critical intellectualism, right, that you and I perhaps wish to participate in, seems to have broken down in the way in which it explains the world, right? And so we're in this world in which things like conspiracy theory, but also, as your book documents, techniques such as magic or remote viewing or like the outer reaches of neuroscience or the whole kind of complicated web of things that we perhaps dismiss, right, seem to have an effect in the world, seem to be able to explain parts of the world that we don't, in our rational way, don't think they should be explained. And so that's where I want to take this conversation, into that morass of sort of open-ended questions. And I want to start, right, with Tribe V2. This is a new model. It's a machine learning model that's come out. It's by Meta. Can you just tell us, what does it do?
So Tribe V2 is a much more advanced version of models that people have been making in neuroscience labs for the last few years. And what people in computational neuroscience have been doing is essentially putting people in fMRI machines, exposing them to a lot of different sorts of stimulus that can be text or images or what have you, and then recording the neurological reactions people have to that stimulus and making models that will predict how your brain will respond to different kinds of things. So Tribe V2 is basically Facebook's take on that. Obviously, they have a lot more money than, a random, department at UC Berkeley or Cornell. And so they've come up with this pretty robust model called Tribe V2.
And so it can take an image or a text, a sound, and it can predict the brain state that corresponds to that in that image, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what it does, yeah.
Does it work the other way around? Can you say, I want to make this brain state, make me an image that can do that?
That's one of the projects we're working on in my studio right now. That's a little bit more complicated. But yes, there's some work. There was a group at MIT that did something like this for language. There was a guy named Puya Bashavan who was also at MIT as a postdoc working under Jim DiCarlo. And they were using pretty crude GANs to generate stimulus that would maximally activate and simultaneously suppress different neurons in the visual cortex of monkeys. So people are trying to do this stuff for sure, and we're well on our way. Now, how different is that from TikTok making a video that is pretty irresistible to you based on behavioral data. There's a lot of similarities there. But what technologies like Tribe V2 and other models that people are building are doing is making models based on neurological data rather than behavioral data. So essentially getting closer to, how your brain actually works.
So in a sense, there's a kind of the image layer, right, where you are using an image to manipulate the brain.
Yes.
Increasingly looks like actually kind of extraneous to or like it's merely a kind of communication medium rather than from one brain state to another brain state, or from a target brain state to making that brain state real. It's increasingly kind of not necessary in the middle.
Yeah, exactly. If you're the TikTok algorithm, you're trying to collect similar kinds of data, but you're using behavioral data as a proxy. So you're looking at, where somebody's mouse is clicking, how long they're dwelling on a particular image or not, and you're trying to infer essentially neurological data from that. What models like the Tribe model are doing is cutting out that behavioral middleman and essentially trying to speak directly to the brain.
I want to add a little caveat here to our audience, right? Which is to say that there is a kind of a paranoid version of this, which is to say that brain imaging and brain prediction and mind reading and so on are entirely possible right now. As far as I understand, that's not the case yet, right? The kind of the fMRI scan where you take the sort of the gist of what someone is thinking is only a gist, and B, requires that subject to be trained in some particular way. You're shaking your head. You're suggesting actually that's not the case.
That's changing really quickly. I've been working on this for a couple of years, and one of the motifs in those conversations is what some neuroscientists call the helmet. And the helmet is sort of like a stand-in image for the idea that, in 10 years when you go to work, you put a helmet on and you use that to directly talk to your computer. And is that essentially like reading your brain and you're using it as an interface? As of a year ago, nobody really thought the helmet was going to work because you have a skull. And any kind of wearable device is going to use a pretty coarse sensor like EEG that's not very good at getting data out. That tune has changed among a lot of these labs and a lot of the people that study this. And what's changed? What's changed is the advent of LLMs. Now, how does that figure into this? Well, let's assume you put on a helmet and it has a pretty bad sensor on it, but you're reading neurological states and you pick out the words, quick, fox, og. You can use an LLM to infer that the pattern there is the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. And you kind of can synthesize the data in between those coarse data points. And you're going to be right pretty often. So that's why there's a lot more concerned about this essentially mind reading stuff now than there was even a year ago.
Which is terrifying, right?
Yeah.
You were saying your studio is working on it. Maybe you can't tell us, but what do you mean by your studio is working on it? You are not, for our audience's sake, a sort of technologist. You're an artist. What is that? What are you talking about?
We're trying to take things like Tribe V2 and hook them up to image generators without having language as an intermediary state. In other words, can we have direct relationships between images and neurological responses and use that as a medium? I want to use it to make artworks, but it's tricky because the way that the foundation models are built is that images and language are paired throughout the model. And so if you want to generate an image, you have to go through a linguistic representation of that image, which creates a lot. It's very compressed in terms of what that does to the data that you're working with. So ideally what you want to do is have neurological data here, collections of activated neurons and images here, and have those two things be able to talk to each other directly. Right now, you have to go through language as an intermediary. So you would have to say, here's a brain state that represents the word cow. Then you go to the word cow, and then here's the image of the cow, right? I want to just get rid of that language layer.
I'm perhaps not I am a humanist to some extent.
Yeah.
And I feel a great deal of discomfort on the idea that that instead of interacting with what I think of as me, right, which is this forward-facing kind of experiential environment in which I have access to the tools of language, I can reason about the world, people can tell me things and I can think about them and so on. What you're describing is a system that is able to, more than subliminally, but like directly interface with the kinds of brain states that I think of as sort of secondary to my language use. Like my experience of the world is that I am thinking, right? And then the brain states come later. I know that's not the case, but that's my experience of the world. I'm sure it's people watching this, their experience of the world as well, that you are having some sort of rational engagement with the world, right? Yeah. Or you are feeling things and you're thinking them, and that's sort of what is in control. Mm-hmm. But what you're proposing is a model of the brain in which the thinking or the reasoning on top of the language use is actually in some ways a secondary, even parasitic or extraneous dimension of what it means to be a brain, and that brain can be spoken to more or less directly without going through the linguistic thing that we think of as constitutive of ourselves. Is that right?
Yeah. So there's a lot there. So both of these things are right. I mean, so first of all, I don't think that most people who study this believe in this Cartesian model of the brain anymore. I think most people understand perceptions to be so entangled with external stimuli that you can't meaningfully separate the two. When you're talking about this rational part of your brain, the capacity to reason, that certainly exists, but that's only one thing that your brain can do. A huge amount of what your brain does is process things precognitively, right? And your brain will only kick up information to the conscious or reasonable part of your brain when it thinks that there's something there that you need to pay attention to. And your brain throws out the vast majority of stimulus that it brings in. And there's a lot of techniques that are designed to speak to those subconscious parts of your brain and to do things with them. So the most obvious one would be something like stage magic, where the theory of stage magic is if I know how your perceptual apparatus works and I know what the blind spots in that are, I can design gestures that your conscious brain is going to throw away, and I can use those gestures as a means to deliver a payload that when I show you the payload, you're going to have a supernatural experience, right? Because your brain has thrown away the data that would have explained what happened there. There's other forms like this. Hypnosis is another medium where the theory of hypnosis is that I can put you in a kind of meditative state, and when you're in that state, I can speak more directly to your subconscious, and I can do things like therapeutic work, help you quit smoking by essentially rewiring the neurological connections that you associate with smoking. Or I can do things like, if I'm a stage hypnotist, like make you cluck like a chicken or immerse yourself in a bath of ice without feeling cold. So there's a lot of different techniques, of different forms of media, for lack of a better word, that are designed to speak to these lower parts of your brain.
And this is a point that you make in the book, I'm going to get the book out so that people can see it. I've only got a preprint. I put this. This is a completely true story. I put this. I went to Madrid the other day to give a talk, and I got stopped at the airport, and the only thing that they wanted to take out of my bag and look at was this book. Like the airport scanning machine simply picked up How to See Like a Machine, Trevor Paglen. This is a suspicious book. Needs to be scanned. They took it out and they were like, "What's this?" And I was like, "It's a book." Anyway,
That's pretty weird.
Something in this in Verso have done something to this book. I'm pretty sure that there's some sort of mysterious media in here that is confounding airport sensors all over the world. Point is to say, in the book, this is a point that you make, where not just that there are media out there, but that the degree to which these kinds of media, these kind of neural media, or these kind of things that are able to interface seemingly directly with our subconscious perceptions of the world, or our pre-linguistic or our pre-cognitive perceptions of the world, those media they're not just media on their own, but in some ways they make us into a kind of media that is also itself capable of being programmed, manipulated, reorganized, and so on.
Exactly.
And that's a transformation of what it means to be a human.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. If you think about when you prompt an LLM to make an image for you, things in the world prompt you to make images or make text all the time.
What do you mean by that? Give me an example.
Hypnosis is an example of that, right?
Yep.
I'm essentially prompting you. I'm prompting your brain to go into a different state and to rewire itself. Stage magic, another example of that. There's tons of examples of this. Going back to the 1950s, there's a guy named Vance Packard who wrote a book called The Hidden Persuaders, and it was looking at early forms of market research and was doing things like, I'm going to give you the same laundry detergent, and I'm going to put one packet of it in a yellow box, one in a blue box, and one in a yellow and blue box. And you're going to perceive that detergent doing different things based on the color of the packaging, essentially. So there's a pretty long history of trying to do this stuff and different forms of media that are, predatory on that, for lack of a better word.
That's the sort of advertising side. We've talked a little bit about the kind of the subterfuge side, the sort of conspiratorial side. We'll come back to conspiracy a bit later because I think it is like a fascinating kind of realm of thought, and it's important to be able to get a handle on it. I think you are, if anyone I know, you are the person to get a handle on our epistemic chaos. I don't know how you feel about that designation. Maybe a quieter life would be more preferable.
That's what I spend much of my time trying to parse.
So there's the advertising side. There's the history of magic and of persuadability. There's the history of hypnosis and various therapeutic techniques, including other kinds of therapy, reflective therapy, Carl Rogers' idea. And they all seem to be coming together to create this new soup of media that we live in, including the media that we are becoming as well, right? So the media of generative AI, the media of advertising campaigns that do various sort of strange things to us, the media of military psyops, the media of disinformation, all these different kinds of media seem to have this kind of long trail or long history. And I want to take us through that history now, or rather, I want you to take us through that history now, because this is what it's always the book is about.
How far back do you want to go? I mean, we got to go to the Old Testament if you want.
Tell us why we'd go to the Old Testament. What does that mean? What's the?
Well, you can go to the Old Testament
because of the graven images.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, people like it's the second commandment says. Everybody thinks that it says you won't have idolatrous images or graven images, but if you read the text, it actually is a blanket prohibition on the creation of images, period, right?
Yeah.
Says, no graven images nor any depiction of anything that's in the heavens above or in the seas below or anything on the earth, what have you. And it's an interesting story there. I mean, one of the stories that I tell that's funny about that second commandment is that God issues that commandment. It's a bigger deal than murder, right? Higher up on the list. Number 2, right after, you'll have no gods before me. And then right after issuing that, God tells the Israelites to make an image. And, it's make a sculpture that's like this many cubits tall and this many cubits wide and has cherubim on the top. It's the Ark of the Covenant, right? Yep. And so what is the Ark of the Covenant? Well, the Ark of the Covenant starts doing stuff. So the Israelites start hauling it around and it, parts the River Jordan, it topples the walls of Jericho. It's essentially this supernatural meme. And the Israelites start treating the ark as if it were a weapon that they can control. And they're in a war with the Philistines, and they're losing. And they're trying to figure out what to do. And they decide to bring the ark to the battlefield. There's going to be a battle, this place called Aphek in 1050 BCE, something like that. And the Israelites imagine that they're going to be invincible if they have the ark. The Philistines have heard about the ark. They're pretty scared of it, but nonetheless, they charge the Israelites with, chariots and iron weapons at this battle. Israelites, they, raise the ark. They assume like a wall of fire is going to come out or something that will defeat the Philistines. The opposite happens. The Philistines overrun them, kill 30,000 of them, and steal the ark. And I think about this as a very relevant allegory for the kind of image world that we live in now, and as an allegory for thinking about the power of images and their limitations. And so we have this kind of prehistory of essentially magic and memes and whatever you want to call it. And we have a thread that goes from there right to the present. We can skip over, a lot of stuff in the meantime. But I thought it might be good to just ground this in a very old story,
What's the analogy between the Ark of the Covenant or the kind of that story and the present? Maybe I didn't understand that.
Oh, I mean, I think of it as very similar to believing that the prompting of images is the same thing as the prompting of reality. And I think that this is a big feature of, at least how the United States is working these days, right? Particularly when we look at something like the Trump administration that is, on one hand, prompting images of, Trump as Superman or Jesus or what have you, and at the same time removing sensors from the oceans so we literally just do not have data about climate change, with the idea being that if we don't have data about it, then it just goes away. So in other words, like the arc seems like a story to me about the possibilities and dangers of confusing images with reality.
There's also another dimension there, which is the illusion of invincibility and the illusion of invincibility allows you to do, right? Very clearly, Iran is winning the Iran war, right? And right. The current pause, and not even in the kind of the slow, drawn out way that the Vietnamese, for example, won the Vietnam War, right? Which took a long time, and lots of propaganda about, and it was very confusing. And the Americans seemed to be winning all the major battles, and there was kind of like a story people could tell, even though they lost, right? There seemed to be kind of winning constantly. In the Iran War, it's just straight up, like they are just losing. And in that sense, there is that is the undermining of the image of empire.
Exactly.
The image of the illusion of power that precedes and indeed replaces eventually the actuality of power.
Those are the chariots, right?
Yeah.
Having said that, like the prompting of reality through images does do a lot of stuff. Right? It does change people's minds. It does sculpt reality to a certain extent. It does mobilize armies. It does, create beliefs, what have you. So we shouldn't downplay the role of that either.
This is what I wanted to get into with that conspiracy theory question at the very beginning, in a
Ramsey
sense,
Dukes.
right? Which is like that. Yes, you can think that the task of the intellectual, the task of the critic, the task of the politically activated person is to do what, in some ways, the liberal pundit, right? Ezra Klein, most clearly among them, he sees his task as separating disinformation from reality, from truth, right? And in some ways, the task of the critical intellectual, or the kind of the intellectual from the left, has often been to say, no, actually, the constitution of reality in a set of facts is not enough. You have to find that deeper structure. You have to find that kind of determining thing that tells you that, okay, maybe you've got to the point of the story where it seems like you've got a kind of network of power, or you've got the nephew of some Saudi prince, right, who is gay, right, in your example. You've got that, but that doesn't tell you how power operates. You have to go deeper than that. You have to find the structural conditions. You have to find, and it's only when you've gone past the place where will seems to be the determining element of the world and into the place where structure tells will what to do that you've reached truth or reality. And that seems to me fundamentally has broken down, right?
Yeah.
Both the liberal gaslighting stuff and the critical intellectual stuff.
Yeah. So this is at the core of one of the shifts that I'm feeling anyway, is that, we had a go-to structure in the past, which was capitalism, right? I mean, so like when you look at the, much of the history of people writing about images from a critical perspective are in this Marxian tradition where you're essentially doing ideology critique and kind of showing how the images that we see tell stories that naturalize, capitalist power relations, right? That's 98% of what, any Marxist cultural critic has been doing, up through people like Baudrillard, who I recently reread as I was I just thought, everything feels like a simulation. Let's go read Simulacrum and Simulation again. I was like, this is a terrible book. This is still, it's still assuming this kind of like essentially a kind of base superstructure model in the Marxian language, and that doesn't feel right to me. That it feels to me like we're living in a different era now. Now, I'm not saying that we're like in a post-capitalist moment. I'm not saying that exploitation isn't real. I'm not saying that like let's throw away the whole Marxian analysis. But there does seem to me something more supernatural / neurological going on now that is different than the Roland Barthes critiquing advertisements.
Do not let me forget to come back to that supernatural / neurological binary, because I think in a lot of people's head there could not be two things further apart than like claims about the supernatural and claims about neuroscience, but they actually have a clearer, like a more confusing Mobius strip of things between them. I guess so. There's this critic that we had on Novara FM, RIT, which called Søren Mao, a Danish Marxist, and he writes about what he calls mute compulsion. And I think it's a great book. People should go and read it. It's a really exciting theory of the world. And his idea is basically that in the critique of capitalism, you have this sort of ideology aspect. You have this kind of direct violence aspect. But you also have this third thing, which is compulsion. And he says that instead of looking at the ways in which people believe the wrong thing, right, which is what ideology critique can be sort of boiled down to in a very, very simplistic way, or in the ways in which direct physical violence is meted out, we should look at the ways in which capitalism constructs environments in which people cannot do anything but act in the ways that they act. Right? There is a kind of a field of the world that compels us in certain ways. And it really strikes me that what you're doing in the world of images is trying to move in some ways from an ideology critique to a compulsion critique, where it is about the way in which the environment of images, advertising images, but also like manipulative images in all different other kinds of ways, determine what you do in a way that goes beneath ideology or behind the back of ideology, behind the back of our brains, behind the back of language into our brains. Yes. Yeah. So maybe that's an extension of Marxism rather than a repudiation.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a very much maps onto how I'm thinking. You can think about actions and like capitalism making a range of actions possible and prescribed, and making other kinds of things that you can do impossible and certainly not prescribed. We can extend that to the worlds of perceptions and the relationship between perception, cognition, action, what have you. And I think there's something there. I mean, like, if you use a kind of ideological critique framework, you cannot explain why you're looking at a 20-second video on TikTok of somebody eating spaghetti. You can't do it. There's something else going on there.
Is that the thing you're looking at? Okay, genuine question.
Yeah.
What do you get on what's your Discover page on Instagram?
Oh, just all kind of crap. I mean, like it changes. But I mean, it's really weird. I mean, once I figured out the extent that it was prompting me, I sort of try to game it by, almost like in Dune, when you have to walk in these weird steps to like prevent the worm from like getting the pattern of you and coming consuming. I feel like I'm like that with a lot of my feeds now.
Yeah, you think it is an adversarial media, but it doesn't realize that you are adversarial media for Instagram or for TikTok or whatever it is. I don't know who's going to win that arms race. I'm not sure. I hope it's you.
No, you have no chance. You can just try to walk in staggered patterns across the desert for short amounts of time.
Because there is this technique called pattern of life analysis, right, which is part of the kind of the intelligence playbook, where you take a very large amount of information about someone's life and you construct a pattern. And then you can try and decide or try and imagine certain things about that person. Very famously used in the drone war in Afghanistan and Pakistan under the Obama administration. It's a way of saying, okay, well, that person hangs out with those two people, and those two people we think are probably in some sort of terrorist network, or they have friends who are in a terrorist network, and therefore we can kill them with impunity, right? So it's a technique of murder, or it's a prelude to murder. In that
that's the signature strike paradigm. And when I heard about that, I thought it meant the president had to write their signature to like authorize somebody to be killed. But no, it's just a metadata signature, like elects you to be assassinated.
As in, so metadata here just means that, not the content of the message between me and my friends, but the fact there was a message at all. Just like that kind of level of metadata.
Yeah, that pattern
could be
of
totally
life,
innocuous.
Yeah.
And so this is why I'm bringing this up in this instance, to think about how you could become adversarial to Instagram or to TikTok. Because there is a thing called, and people can see on the screen here, two very similar pictures, almost identical pictures, if you're a human. There's a thing called the 1 pixel attack, where you take a picture of a horse, which the machine learning system that you're using is capable of saying that's a horse with 100% certainty. And then you change exactly 1 pixel in it, and the entire system breaks. And it doesn't know what that is anymore. In this case, it thinks that it's an automobile, but it says that with less than 0.5% accuracy. So it really, really, really doesn't know. One question I've been having for a very long time, since I thought about 1 pixel attacks and about pattern of life analysis, is it possible to do a kind of injection attack, right? Or sorry, is it possible to do a kind of 1 pixel attack on your own life such that you become invisible to the system that is trying to predict you? Like, is there a video on Instagram that I could watch that would completely break Instagram's sense of who I am?
I don't know enough about how that algorithm works, but my guess is no, because like that is like a huge amount of data aggregated from many, many different sources and put together. And I'm not sure that there's one poison pill that you could do. There are theoretical attacks that people have tried to think about vis-a-vis LLMs, where I forget that there was one, I think it was called Nightshade attacks, where the idea was that you would like poison different data sets, right? And then see how that poisoning would play out over the entire system. My intuition is that no, you're not going to be able to do that for the Instagram feed. But related to this 1 pixel attack on pattern of life, you're talking about adversarial images in a digital context and in a computer vision context. There was a weird paper that some people from Google were involved with, and I think it came out about 2 or 3 years ago, where they were looking at whether these kinds of adversarial images worked on humans, using like literally the same techniques that you'd use to spoof a classifier. And what they found was that it was pretty negligible, but it worked. Like, in other words, you could get like 1.5%, success rate in generating those images for humans. And, when you step back, you're like, okay, well, that's not that big a deal. But on the other hand, at the scale of the internet, like 1% of people is like a lot of people. I mean, elections in the U.S. are won by less than 1% of the vote. So there again, here we are again in this, supernatural / neurological space where we're talking about media and techniques that are designed to influence these parts of your perceptual and cognitive stack that you don't have a lot of control over.
Let's do the history, right? So like this is the kind of the soup we're at. This is the experience I think people have lots of the day. They experience themselves as being prompted in some ways by their feeds, being prompted by various kinds of things around them in a way that I think feels quite invasive. We will come on to the kind of the future of this a bit later. But for now, I want to take us all the way back. Not all the way back. Yep. We are not going back to the Old Testament. We are going back merely to the 1940s. Yeah, 50s. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. With a collection of things that get discovered after the Second World War. And this connects very deeply to the episode that we did with Alfred McCoy, right, on the Cold War, because the initiatory spark for the famous program people probably have heard of called MK Ultra is the Korean War. Various American soldiers are kidnapped. Kidnapped, is that the right word? No, they're captured.
They're captured. They're prisoners of war, yeah.
Yeah, they're prisoners of war, and then they are shown on TV to be reading out or to saying things about like the US is committing war crimes, to be that kind of thing. The only explanation that is feasible for the CIA at that time is they've been brainwashed. So they then start to try and reverse engineer the process of brainwashing they think these people might have gone through. What did they discover? What did they try?
So MK Ultra was a response to these prisoner of war videos. They're trying to figure out whether the North Koreans and Chinese had figured out some way to essentially hijack the mind of these soldiers. So they were trying to reverse engineer this, and they tried lots and lots of different things. So they were doing a lot of experiments with things like LSD, hallucinogenic drugs. They were doing things like Ewan Cameron at McGill was trying to do something called psychic driving, where they would like put you in basically an isolation chamber and, read you a text for 2 weeks that would say something like, your mother hates you, what have you. They were doing things like experimenting with direct electric stimulation for the brain. Basically anything that they could think of. This was a massive, massive program that involved, as far as I can tell, almost everybody involved in psychology and early forms of like neuroscience at that time was kind of on the payroll here. But they had weird things that they were doing as well. They were looking into paranormal phenomena, things like telekinesis, ESP. One of the first people that they hired, and who's on your board here, is a guy named John Mulholland, who was a stage magician who did a couple things for CIA. He was trying to adopt techniques from stage magic to be used in covert operations. And the other thing he was doing was investigating supernatural phenomena for CIA. He was trying to assess the validity of different spirit mediums. He was trying to assess the validity of things like UFO sightings. And so the point here is that they were kind of throwing everything they could think of at the wall and see what sticks.
And what stuck? Like, what actually came out of this concretely? I mean, I know that we don't know fully because this guy, Richard M. Bissell Jr., ordered it to be destroyed in 1973. But that's a good 20 years later. So what actually stuck? What came out of this that was proved to work? I mean, LSD works, I know from personal experience, but what does it work to do?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a really good point. Nobody knows exactly what the kind of successes of this project were, because Richard Bissell had all the documentation from MK Ultra burnt in the early 1970s, and a lot of the key players in it also burnt their own archives. So what we have left is records from that program that were in a different place, that were more associated with accounting and things like that. And so that's really our glimpse into it. We do know that a lot of the experiments done as part of MK Ultra made their way into interrogation manuals, right? So there was a famous manual, and this is very much Alfred McCoy territory. There was it was called the Kubark Manual, I think, came out at that time. And that became a kind of blueprint that gets carried forward into things like, we were seeing at some of the black site prisons during the War on Terror, some of the things going on at Abu Ghraib, those kind of things. So we have this history of interrogation. We have another history that comes out of MK Ultra, which involves a kind of CIA continued exploration of the supernatural. So, for example, the guy who's head of MK Ultra was a guy named Sidney Gottlieb, and Gottlieb, the MK Ultra winds down for the most part in the 1960s or migrates to a few other programs. One of those programs that gets spun up was the remote viewing program. So like trying to teach people how to be psychic spies. And that goes from the early 70s through the 1990s. So you just, you have these histories of, essentially out there experiments that continue beyond MK Ultra, as well as, a lot of interrogation stuff, psyops stuff. Probably a lot of disinformation techniques also probably come out of MK Ultra.
This Valentine's Day, the thing that my girlfriend did for me as a kind of like a romantic treat was we did the remote viewing techniques from the other room in our house. So like one of us is in the bedroom, one of us is in the kitchen, and like there's an image, right? And like you have to kind of sit and meditate and see if you can do the kind of thing. We didn't get very good at it, but the results are not totally negligible, right?
Yeah.
The results of the program are actually nothing, and you'd think they'd be nothing.
You'd think
how do you account for that? Like, how do you account for that? Because you are a rational person. You are not given to the supernatural. Is it just that there was lots of prediction and when they're trying to do these remote viewing tasks, where they're trying to look at something that is thousands of miles away? Do they just like make a lot of guesses and sometimes they were right? Or is there something more to this? Were they pass secret information? Were they being prompted in some other subliminal way? How do you account for that?
So I'm very deep in this rabbit hole now. I've been going through a lot of the archives of the remote viewing program and have like recovered a lot of weird stuff that I don't think people really know about. I'm actually working on a whole body of artworks and an exhibition that's kind of inspired by a lot of this stuff. How do we account for what was going on there? The successes are tricky to evaluate. I mean, it seems like what they arrived at was that there's something here, but it is not predictable nor reliable enough to be used in a military context, right? And it's really hard to know how much of this is kind of creating impressions that then fit stories about the world after the fact. You don't know how much of it is essentially chaos magic versus, something more rational. And what I mean by chaos magic is generating patterns that you see in other places, right? I can generate a pattern of words. You're going to perceive that in some kind of, your mind is going to fill in the blanks of those patterns of words to derive an intelligible story from it. You think about like those refrigerator magnets. You have all these different words. You put a bunch of them together in your refrigerator. Your mind synthesizes a poem out of that seems to make sense. So something similar is probably definitely going on with remote viewing, whereas like you're prompting me to see something. I'm giving you a string of words. You're then looking for a relationship between those words and the quote unquote target. And you will find that because humans are very, very good at pattern matching, right? Even when there's no pattern there. Is something supernatural going on there? I don't know. I mean, I'm honestly agnostic about that. If there is something supernatural going on, it is not sufficiently predictable to be used operationally. I mean, that part of it seems pretty clear.
You mentioned earlier that pretty much all the psychologists of the era were sort of seemingly involved in this. Not of course all of them, but like many of them.
Yeah.
On the board, we've got Donald Hebb, who is responsible for the foundational claim in neuroscience, which is about called Hebbian learning, neurons that fire together, wire together. My understanding of this is that like the electricity comes down the neuron, and that attracts insulation, methylation, to attract around the around the neuron, which means that it's more insulated, which means that the next time around it works better. Of course, there is another tradition of psychology, or another tradition of psychiatry, or psychoanalysis, in fact, which is Freudian psychoanalysis. And the image there in Freud of how the mind works is that this experience that you and I are having, right, is actually just sort of the tip of the iceberg. And beneath that, there is a whole roiling mass of demands for power and immediate gratification from the id, and then the superego as the sort of regulatory ideal. What is the image of the person that we get when we look at these experiments in the MK Ultra sort of zone? Is it that we are thinking about the person as an almost like quasi supernatural antenna able to pick up radio signals and so on? Is it that we're thinking about them as a fully rational person? And what is that, what is the image of the person that comes out of this set of experiments, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, like when you look at the PsyOps literature, MK Ultra literature, a lot of the advertising literature, it is, you do not arrive at the kind of bourgeois, free-thinking subject. What you arrive at is a kind of a theories of subjectivity where mostly what your subjectivity is are accumulated experiences, like just neurological wiring, a lot of things that you have very, very little control over. You do have a rational layer on top of that, but that rational layer can often and somewhat easily be overwritten by knowing what psychological techniques will override that. This is like why rage bait works online. That's kind of the proof of this, right? You just look at like online discourse, and it is so captured by basically lizard brain dynamics,
I don't find myself captured by it. Like I don't.
No, I don't either. But that's because I don't look at it and I don't engage with it. But I suspect the more you engage with it, and the more that you become involved in those incentive systems, the more that you would. If you realize that by shit posting, you get a bunch of followers, you get a reward based on that. You're kind of stepping into this dopaminogenic economy that is very similar to addiction, among people who study it.
My New Year's resolution for the last 2 years has been to use social media more. But it hasn't stuck. It hasn't stuck. Like I will look at Twitter.
There's some people are more susceptible to gambling addiction. Some people are more susceptible to nicotine addiction. We all have different makeups there.
Let's talk about Woody Bledsoe.
Yeah, so Woody Bledsoe is a real interesting guy. He did a PhD at Berkeley, worked at Sandia Labs, weirdly, at Kirtland Air Force Base for a while. This would have been in early 1950s. Then he goes back to what is now Silicon Valley, and he sets up an outfit called Panoramic Research. So they're doing experimental research projects. Their main client is the CIA. And the two big projects they do is they basically try to invent face recognition for CIA. So CIA wants a way to look at photographs and then use a computer to identify the people in the photographs. And so Bledsoe, attempts to do that. That was not an MK Ultra project. That was just a generic CIA project. And then he does have one of these MK Ultra projects, something called Subproject 94. Again, this is one of the projects we don't know a whole lot about, but we do know that it was trying to control animals essentially via remote control. So what we think he was doing was putting electrodes in the brains of dogs, burros, different kind of creatures, and then essentially try to control their movements remotely. So it was a secret version of work very similar to what Jose Delgado was doing at Yale. And Delgado was doing famous public experiments where he'd put electrodes in the brains of a bull and then have the bull charge him, and then he'd press a button and the bull would kind of veer out of the way. We know that something went terribly wrong with this Bledsoe project in the mid-1960s. The CIA comptroller said that the project had gone, quote unquote, off the rails, and they defunded it. And Bledsoe then closed up Panoramic Research and went into academia. He was a professor at UT Austin for a long time after that. So what happened, we don't really know. But this is like 64, 65 when this stuff
which is a long time before the CIA kind of clears up its act with the Church Committee, right? That's which is 73, I want to say.
Yeah,
75.
this is the age when everybody's going crazy. Also academia had not cleaned up its act either. There's not really human subject protocols. A lot of wildly unethical experimentation going on at that time.
Why didn't they carry on with it? Because it does. Maybe they did. We just don't know about it, right? Is that the conclusion that we have to come to?
I don't know. I think they did carry on with this. I think there was another lab in Baltimore, I think at Johns Hopkins, that was working on this stuff as well. On one hand, we can say that they didn't carry on with it. On the other hand, what is Neuralink? It's basically that, So this stuff definitely persists to the present, or at least this lineage did not die.
Let's go through the rest of the lineage, because there's this other kind of I do want to come to the Neuralink stuff eventually. We have down here. This is one of those episodes that really kind of sprawls across the whole map. And, we do have some sort of Neuralink things down here. Well, Quinn Slobodian and Ben Tarnoff, who we interviewed a while back, have this idea of Elon Musk's cyborg turn. And the idea there is that instead of basically what we're talking about now, which is this process whereby the rational structure of humans is replaced with the free flow of memes, right?
Yeah.
And this is very, very cringe in Elon Musk's hands, where he talks about he who controls the memes controls the world.
Yeah.
But there is something to the kind of the way in which people become things to be prompted, or the way in which we reduce other humans to mere sort of like AIs, right? People become more like AIs than AIs become more like people, in a sense. Like there is a kind of a collapsing of the human into the technological. And I think
the human into the image, right? I mean, these are the technological image.
But there does need to be, the image is a sort of my understanding of where we were going earlier, maybe I'm wrong, you can correct me. My understanding was that the image as a thing you can actually see, right, was taken to be more or less supplemental to a sort of deeper process of processing and subconscious awareness, both in people and in, for example, the CCTV camera that does that thing where it draws a square around a thing it thinks is a person, or draws a square around my face, which you can see on your screen right now. Jonah, thank you for putting that on, right? This is the thing that there is my understanding was that images had become a kind of supplemental layer that actually were unnecessary to the operation of power. But maybe that's not where you were going.
No, I think that is true. And also, I'm not saying to get rid of representation entirely. I'm just saying that representations can be a part of that cognitive circuit, right? In other words, when you see the Trump meme of him making himself Jesus, you understand the rhetoric of the image, the representational content of the image, but it's also doing affective work, right? It's also it's inducing a response in you, right? And it is also it's altering reality in the sense that it is altering the range of what is thinkable and what is seeable, right?
To think about what is the range of what is thinkable and what is seeable, I want to come on to maybe the kind of the most for me, exciting sort of story in your book. But also exactly the same thing we talked about last time. So, we're going to go over some old territory here, but there is actually so much more. Richard Doty was an Air Force officer of the Special Investigations Special Agent, and he you met him. You've met him many times. You made a film with him.
Yeah.
When Alfred McCoy, who we, as I mentioned, had on before, when he met Roger Trinquier, who is this French counterinsurgency officer, he described Roger Trinquier, who is the very imposing man, as extending his penumbra of power over him. That's how Alfred McCoy described it. And that makes a lot of sense because Roger Trinquier, as you can see, dressed in his army fatigues here, right, like is a serious military operator, a very scary man.
Yeah.
What was it like, perhaps in comparison, so we can think about the different forms of power involved here, to meet psyop agent extraordinaire Richard Doty?
So I wanted to do the film with Doty because I thought of him as like really an allegory for media in the age of AI, right? He's essentially somebody who will tell very outlandish stories that will often turn out to be true at key places. And those stories are mixed with a lot of fantastical details that are difficult to believe. And he is trained to essentially manipulate your perception. Now, I know that, several of the people that he ran psyops against essentially went insane. And so I was very afraid to meet him, not because I thought that, there was going to be any kind of violence or something like that, but in my mind, he was almost this like Lovecraftian figure where, you struggle to maintain your sense of sanity when you interact with somebody like that. He's very unassuming. He's very warm. He's a very friendly guy. We actually got along great. But when you're talking to him, you do feel your grounding in reality slipping away. And that's because he's trained to tell stories that are designed to do that, right? And there's a craft to it, and he knows that craft. And he'll explain to you exactly what the craft is, and then he'll do it on you, and it still works, right? So it's, again, one of these things that still works even when you know what the trick is, right? So I was pretty, nervous about meeting him, and it's tricky. He talked a lot about when you're in school for doing this kind of psyops work, and he talks about the fact that most people wash out. And most people wash out, like, not because they can't do enough push-ups or whatever it is, but most people wash out because you kind of have to be a sociopath to be able to do this work, right? You have to be able to essentially lie and deceive people in ways that are, far beyond, the little kind of white lies that, all of us engage in, but we don't generally, if you're not a crazy person, don't rise to the level of the types of deceptions you are expected to do when you're in that field. Yeah.
What are the principles of psyops? So if he's learned the trade craft, like what are the things that guide that?
Yeah, so there's all these, psychological factors that go into it. The main one that he talks about is what he calls like the Magruder principle, which is named after a Confederate general. And basically the principle says that what you want to do is figure out what somebody's pre-existing beliefs are, and then you want to amplify those. And so you start with what somebody believes already, you push it further and further and further, and you push it into whatever place that you want it to go in. But it's much easier to encourage somebody to go down a path that they're already on than it is to go onto a different path. The importance of feedback is another one that I think is really interesting. It's almost kind of cybernetic idea that you need to be monitoring the effects of what you're doing on the person and be continually refining them and customizing them to that person. And to me, that was just really interesting because like that's literally what, the algorithm is. And you can think about the algorithm as, using this particular psyop technique, for example. I mean, you can also think about it as using the Magruder's principle, bringing you further down a rabbit hole that you're already primed to go down.
Can we talk about exactly what he does to Paul Benowitz? Is that possible? So what is it? So Paul Benowitz is a already, as far as I understand it, using this Magruder technique, an amateur UFO investigator.
Yeah.
And we should probably say that Richard Doty is stationed at Kirtland Air Force Base, which is in New Mexico, and is the site where people think a lot of very advanced Air Force material is tested. Planes, drones, who knows, you name it. It's probably in that kind of area. And so his job at this Air Force Base is to keep all of this a secret. Not by preventing people from seeing it, but in some ways by causing them to see something else, or really maybe what they want to see that is more exciting than the truth, or depending on how much you believe the psyop is real, right? Like making people believe mundane things when actually something very exciting is happening. That's the real question. So what does he do to Paul Benowitz particularly?
So Paul Benowitz was a military contractor that worked at Kirtland Air Force Base, and his house was on the fence line. And so when we talk about what Kirtland Air Force Base is, it's not just a collection of buildings. It's like a huge, huge swath of desert. They're doing aerospace testing in there. They're doing electronic warfare. NSA's there. There's a bunch of nuclear stuff there. And this is, late 70s. This is the height of, research on electronic warfare, early stealth airplanes, et cetera. So Benowitz is living on the fence line, and he starts seeing weird things flying around above the desert, in the restricted area. And he starts setting up cameras and he starts setting up radio receivers. So he's starting to collect electronic transmissions from the area as well. And he comes to believe that what he's seeing are UFOs harassing the military. And so he's got all this documentation, and because he works at the base, he's going to report it, say like, hey, just so you know, I've been collecting this stuff. So he goes to the base, and Rick Doty is the guy who's waiting for him. Now, in all likelihood, Benowitz had discovered some artifacts related to some top secret NSA program or some kind of electronic warfare program. And Doty's job was to protect that. Benowitz did have a pre-existing interest in UFOs, I think pretty casually. Benowitz interpreted what he saw as UFOs. And so what Doty's approach was to use this Magruder principle and says like, yes, in fact, you are seeing UFOs and they're a problem, and I'm going to help you to discover the truth about them. So keep doing what you're doing. And Doty then starts amplifying that belief, and he starts doing it by really crazy means, like going so far as like installing speakers in Benowitz's house that would like speak to him in alien languages. He kind of creates a Potemkin alien base on the top of a mountain where he knows Benowitz will fly by in his private plane and sort of like notice this construction there. And Doty says, oh, well, it's this alien base. In one of the weirder stories, Doty he arranges for a computer to be delivered to Benowitz, and the computer will ostensibly decode the radio signals that Benowitz is collecting. And what it will do is take the radio signals in, and then it will output texts that are quote unquote the decoded signals. And all of the texts appear to be deliberations among, alien forces that are invading the US. So they're really weird. It's just, there's like thousands of pages of this like gibberish that sounds like, we are crash saucers. We hate you. We're going to invade whatever it is. Right. So Doty really just spins up this whole world for Benowitz, and Benowitz eventually has a mental breakdown. He barricades himself inside of his house with sandbags, and he's institutionalized. Doty does other things like, and it's not clear like what Doty made versus what he just distributed, but he starts to, showing select journalists as well as Benowitz these fake top secret documents that describe 50 years of collaboration between the US government and alien invaders. These would sort of evolve into the famous like MJ-12 papers. The documents also, I think, talk about how Jesus was an alien hybrid. So these really weird stories. One of the people that he passes this stuff on to is this woman that you have on the chart here as well, Linda Moulton Howe. And she kind of takes the bait and has been running with it ever since. So to this day, she's talking about how, there's races of reptilian aliens that are collaborating with the U.S. government in some kind of giant conspiracy theory. And the other person on your chart here is a guy named William Moore. And he is a UFO researcher that Doty recruited to help disseminate these this kind of disinformation within the UFO community, and he's working very closely with Bill Moore. So there's a web of people here, and there's a web of insanity, honestly, that is the result of all of this. A lot of this particular psyop then also makes its way into popular culture. It evolves into something called the dark side hypothesis, which I think was first articulated by a guy named John Lear, and also becomes the plot of the television show, The X-Files, right? Because people in the UFO community are talking about these documents. I think Chris Carter goes to a UFO convention, hears this story, and it becomes like the plot of the television show. So, these things leak out and go much further than they were ever intended to go.
The thing with Bill Moore was that he was offered by Doty proof of aliens, right? Yeah. If he disinformed this other person.
Exactly.
Presumably, like one would ask, well, are you just not going to be disinforming me? Right? Like, why would I participate in a psyop when I know that someone else you might as well be psyoping me as well? It's a strange.
There are wheels within wheels in this world.
Well, there are wheels within wheels, but like is there another wheel? Like, is Richard Doty himself the subject of a psyop? Like, does he really do this?
100%.
Do you like what's how?
Well, when you talk to him, he said that he was just following orders. That it was all
Sure.
stuff that was coming down from Washington. Now, I don't totally believe that, but that's his story. But I think he changes that story also in different contexts.
Yes, I imagine so. I imagine he tells people that he changes the story as well, and tells him that he tells him that he's changing the story for a certain effect, and then the effect still works, even though you understand that you're doing this.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of kind of like interesting aspects of the UFO phenomena that I think are really interesting. You make this brilliant point, I have to say, which is that in the age of AI, every image is a UFO image, which is that like the UFO image is this. I'm going to butcher what you wrote in the book, but like is a kind of a thing that is really a photograph about photography because it is placed on the threshold of believability all the time. And something about the condition of AI means that every image will eventually be on this kind of threshold of indiscernibility if we're not even there already. So go on.
No, I think we are. I mean, when I wrote the book mostly, in the early part of last year, and I could see coming that there would be a moment where the relationship between images and reality would be upended, right? And I noticed like the day after the US started bombing Iran, I had a moment where I was looking online trying to figure out what actually is going on here. And I realized that my mind had flipped, and instead of like looking for the kind of pieces of crap and throwing it out, I was like looking for things that I thought were reliable and trying to bring them in. And it was like, whoa, okay, that happened like that. That's a moment to notice, to pay attention to, where the default reading of media changes.
And because of that default reading changing, there is a sense that we are now in an arms race, right, that is kind of slipping away from us, in which the tools that we use to create media and the tools that we use to detect whether or not media is fake are now arms racing themselves into kind of,
No, exactly.
oblivion.
Like, yeah,
semiotic nonsense, or kind of like a world in which like it's impossible to work out whether or not things are true or false. And this feels like what it might have felt like from the inside of being Paul Benevitz, right? This is like what it might have, even though there are certain things that you're absolutely certain of.
Yeah.
Even when you try and explain them to other people, they just feel like they dissolve.
Exactly. And this is so crazy. And this is happening in so many domains. It's not just in the domain of like, oh, is this actually an image of something that happened in the world? This is in the domain of writing. Like, is this a text that was actually authored by a person? There is this, it kind of pisses me off where like you're seeing AI cannibalizing image culture and also written culture. There's all these things you can't write now anymore because it's AI coded. Like you can't use the word genuinely anymore. You can't use M dashes anymore. There's almost like you're struggling to write because you're realizing that also in the style that you write, and you're also trying to do a proof of work that you're a human, right? This is a very strange situation to be in.
Yes, proof of brain or something. Proof of
exactly,
proof of like flesh. Like there's some sort of way in which you're trying to establish to other people, no, I'm a real person. I'm not like a kind of a simulation.
Yeah, I think we'll have like some really weird forms of slang that will come out of that, and really weird forms of writing. I've even noticed that like in my own writing, like I've been much more swashbuckling in the style that I write with, because I just know that like AI would not do that.
Right. Okay. So you become less disciplined, right? Because there is a certain kind of like constrainedness to the quality of AI prose.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. I think there is something. I mean, maybe an overused reference, but there is something. I feel like we are heading towards an almost like Adam Curtis view of Vladislav Surkovian world. So Vladislav Surkov, was deputy prime minister of Russia. It is alleged, right, that Surkov ran in the 2000s, I think, and maybe in the 90s as well, a collection of campaigns to essentially destroy the political culture of Russia.
Yeah.
Not by putting everyone under the thumb of the secret police or, beating them up if they came and did protests, but through amplifying almost everything. So I think how it went is that he would essentially pay groups from all over the political spectrum. So groups on the far left, groups on the far right, groups on parts of the political spectrum that only Russia has, like the Liberal Democratic Party, which you should look up, Nazbol, National Bolshevism, not liberal, not democratic, scarcely a party. But he would pay these people to do political activities, and then he let it be known that is what he was doing, right? And therefore their credibility collapses. And I think what this leads to is mass resignation, a mass belief that the public sphere cannot be trusted, that it is not clear how to act in that world. And I really feel like that's where we're heading to with the kind of the slop nonsense world that we experience now. I don't know. Is that too depressing, or is that? Or I mean, you're an artist.
No, I mean,
you have thoughts about images. You have thoughts about what to do in this kind of environment. Where do we grasp for agency in that terrifying slop world?
No, I think that's completely right. And like this is another technique that's in the psyops literature. Is like you're destabilizing truth is an end in and of itself, right? Because the idea is like if you can completely destabilize the idea of a shared reality or a particular reality, you can fill that in with whatever you want, mostly through coercion, right? Or mostly with some kind of fascism, right? And so like Surkov is certainly, a very much a Doty type figure who's trying to do at scale, the kinds of techniques that Doty was doing in a much more limited capacity, and using those as a way to essentially create the groundwork for fascist politics.
The other example, of course, we could reach for here in terms of a kind of mass loss of contact with reality, which I think has become completely pervasive in the last few years, right? It's just one of the reasons, I mean, just to break the fourth wall here for a second, like one of the reasons why we are doing this, right? Despite being this kind of the giant attempt to map all the whole world, right? Is because despite being an impress regulated news organization, despite being that, we are doing the kind of thing that looks insane because this is the kind of thing that actually makes people engage with the world, right? They are, this conspiracy theory is a technology of bringing people into the world. And if you can make people believe in conspiracy theories, you can move them from being on that kind of conspiratorial, anti-authoritarian dimension that someone like Alex Jones was in the early 2000s to becoming essentially a full authoritarian. Like, because you can attach them to your project. And if you can make it seem like the state project, in this case, Trumpism, is the project of uncovering the conspiracy in the form of QAnon, then you can make people who are anti-authoritarians into authoritarians by like evacuating the space of reason. Right?
Exactly.
And that is a kind of terrifying process.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's like the bigger stakes that we're talking about when we're talking about this new world of images and activations and what have you, is I think where we're going with this is ultimately, if we like the idea of democracy and if liberal democracy is premised on a form of empiricism that is being undermined through new forms of media and technology, then what do we imagine democracy can be?
Let's think about that. In more than the
question.
kind of well, I mean,
I don't have an answer to it, but I feel like that's like the question, like with that a lot of these conversations are trying to we're trying to develop a vocabulary to have a version of an informed version of that conversation, and we don't even really have that vocabulary yet. And I think that's what you're trying to do with this project. That's certainly what I'm trying to do, and I think actually we've made a lot of progress with that over the last couple of years. It feels very bewildering at the moment, but at least I think we can have much more nuanced conversations now than we were able to even 2 years ago.
I feel like there was so after the Freudian trauma, which is a name for the moment in history where Freud comes along and says the bourgeois subject is not the master of their own house, right? The thing we think of as the person is not in charge of the mind, not in charge of the personhood, right? There is something beneath that. That's what I think of as the Freudian trauma. That was the opening up for an enormous amount of artistic and social experimentation, and certainly a whole collection of new therapies and so on. Do you feel like the new neural era of media in which we are circumventing images and going straight to the brain, in which things like Tribe V2, in which there are brain imaging software, in which there is AI-generated slop that is activating you in certain ways, do you think there will be a collection of artistic, therapeutic, social, intellectual projects that can come out of that? Or are we simply sinking into some sort of like precognitive, pre-reflective mire? Surely there must be something.
Yeah, so I think people have different opinions about this, and there's several different paths you can go down. I think the most reasonable one is to put a lot of this stuff into a public health context, right? And so it's kind of stop thinking about media in relation to like very American ideas like free speech or what have you. Like, I'm not saying like I'm not disparaging the idea of free speech, but I'm just talking about we can have a more nuanced understanding of what that means versus what, essentially making addictive drugs in the form of media is, right? So I think that's one kind of framework. I think another framework is, this is going to sound very old-fashioned, but I think it's really important, is to revisit the idea of kind of comprehensive online privacy regulation. So much of whether it's generative AI, whether it's the algorithm, what have you, so much of this is downstream of the fact that we don't have serious guardrails governing data collection, right? So I think that's another really big one here.
I totally agree with that. I think I would say the one thing about that is that right to privacy,
Yeah.
which is foundational to liberal societies, and I think
Yeah.
is incredibly important, is also, in some ways, the right to make conspiracies. Right, the right to privacy is also the right to conspire, and so
No, totally.
the fact that a small tiny group of elite people can organize themselves in certain ways to manipulate the public sphere is because they have a right to privacy. Right?
Yeah.
And there is that profound contradiction or tension inside that right to privacy that I think needs to be further explored.
And I think the thing that people misread about the right to privacy is they think it's about you, and they think it's an individualistic thing, where that's not what it is. It's a public resource. It's a public good, right? It's a collective resource rather than an individual one.
Although one that perhaps is unevenly distributed, and
100%.
But maybe that's the case for everything.
Yeah.
Trevor Paglen, thank you for doing your own research.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful talking to you today.